people go through seasons and phases. And it's one of those things I read where a lot of women are over-mentored, under-sponsored. Step back and say, how do we support individuals through all aspects of their life stages versus put labels on people very quickly, and then the minute they make a slightly different choice, like rip that label apart and like push them to the side.
Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Rashi Kakkar. Rashi is a global leader within McKinsey's leadership and development team. She has led digital transformations, enhanced organizational effectiveness, and redesigned operating models. Given her extensive experience, including but not limited to advising Fortune 100 companies, I'm excited to have her share her insights with you. But before we begin, please note the views that Rashi shares are her own and do not reflect any organizations that she is affiliated with. Let's dive in. Welcome, Rashi. Can you share with us a story that has shaped how you lead yourself and others?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Just excited to sort of be invited to the podcast and get this opportunity to chat with you and your entire community. I guess there's not maybe one story, but maybe a couple of stories, right? And like most people, I've had a bit of a meandering career. I've sort of worked across organizations, across geographies. And I think what that did was very early on in my career gave me exposure to a bunch of different leaders. And then maybe as with most people, you sometimes learn more from experiences where you didn't feel great and you're like, I don't want to be this way. Versus sometimes when you have it really good, you don't realize how good it is unless you experience the bad, right? It's almost like unless you sort of see the darkness, you don't realize where there was sunshine. And so I think in my case, early on in my career, I did work with a certain, leader, and this person was a designated manager who once I kind of moved away from that experience and worked with others, I realized was very authoritative, very sort of leading by fear. It was one of my first professional sort of experiences. And I mean, given obviously I was young, I was raw, I was, pretty new, but I always felt not belittled, but there was the sense of like, I know better, it's very micromanaging. Anything you would write, including an email, they wanted to review it before it would be shared with even people internally, which to me at that point, I was like, this is very interesting. Like I haven't had this experience for a really long time. And almost, they had this sort of operating model where the entire team, they wanted us to like book a team room and like work in the team room together, which is fine. I think sometimes it helps with collaboration, but it also, to a person there, felt like you were always under the eye, right? Even to step out and say, I need a bio break, almost felt a bit like, is someone tracking how many sort of bio breaks I'm taking? And for me, I guess in retrospect, what was one of the big misses that this individual had was they never gave transparent feedback. And so every time you'd get a performance review, I personally feel it should never be a shock to anybody's system. And feedback, especially for someone who's in their first sort of professional role, it should be shared constantly. You should be able to give people the opportunity to rectify mistakes or learn from sort of experiences. And in my case, it almost felt like they would say one thing because they really wanted to be like friends and buddies with you, but then formally other things would be written, right? So I thought that was very surprising. And so as I sort of moved away from this individual and I grew in my career and I met other people, I think that really fundamentally shaped how I said, look, I'm never going to turn up like that, right? Like this person obviously was doing a lot of other things very right, like the upward management was out of the box phenomenal, right? Which is important. But I think the way they made that team feel and the way I felt, for me, became one of those fundamental, foundational things around a title of a manager does not mean you're a leader, and a leader is not like a formal thing. And that maybe is one of those big stories that I carry with myself around. This is exactly how I don't need to show up. And this is exactly how the next sort of generation of leaders should not be showing up.
I'm going to double click into that micromanagement piece. When you take a moment to reflect back on that journey, understanding that your younger self probably didn't know how to advocate for yourself or communicate in a way that could effectively set you and your leader up for success at that time, or your manager up for success at that time. For anyone that would be in a similar situation, they're getting micromanaged the shit out of the situation. It's creating a lot of anxiety, and they're trying to figure out, how do I effectively communicate with this leader? What is a piece of advice that you would offer them?
I think the first thing would really be to like step back and, like you said, have the ability and the confidence to say, okay, I am going to advocate for myself. Whatever this organization is, has it brought me in because they saw something in me, right? It could just be that I'm a fresh sort of graduate, but there's still something they saw in me. And I think the other thing would be, I also recognize this, like trust is sometimes earned. And it's not just when you're new in your career. It could also be if you change organizations, you're leading a new team, you're working with a new team. a lot of times sort of, unless you obviously come with this like history of this reputation, etc., like for most people, like it is at a baseline level where trust is non-existent unless it's established. And what I tell people is anybody who sort of is micromanaging, telling them to stop micromanaging will just make the situation worse, because it almost feels like you're A, putting a label on them, which has a very negative connotation, but B, you're sort of pushing back. I think it needs to start by reframing and saying, hey, okay, look, I understand there's a lot on your plate. I understand you've sort of given me this piece of work. What does good look like for you, right? Let's align on like eventual output. Let's align on good, and let's align on timelines. Like, I understand this is something that needs to go to, somebody maybe day after tomorrow. It's a critical piece of work. Is it possible that end of day today I share a version of where I'm moving so that you can give me feedback on that, right? And I think being a little bit more proactive and saying, what's the cadence in which you want to review it, right? Maybe this person wants to review it every couple of hours, and then you both are aligned, and maybe they're like, okay, once end of day today is fine, or next week is fine, right? Because I think in the absence of you having those explicit communication, also the other thing that I missed was this person was a first time sort of manager, right? And that creates its own set of anxieties and stressors. That they probably were operating from a place of fear because they felt their reputation depended on whatever piece of work that team was doing. So, me at 21, 22 probably didn't have that empathy, which after I became a manager, I do, is to see it from their point of view. And then so I would just say, sort of advocate for yourself, align on what good looks like, align on timelines. And then you as an individual, it's your responsibility to meet them, right? If you meet those timelines, if you sort of meet the level of this is what good looks like, I think it's then fair to tell this person to slowly start giving up control, because they also have that trust battery has started increasing a little bit. Those are a few things I would tell people to do, is a little bit of take it upon yourself versus just go around being like, this is the worst manager I've ever worked with.
I appreciate those tangible like pieces of advice that you offer. And I was listening to another podcast and they talked about how sometimes as leaders, how we measure trust is so different than how us as a direct report would measure trust.
Mhm.
For us, it might be more relationally driven. You as a leader, do your actions back your words? As an example, from the leader's perspective, it's, are you going to get what you said you'll get done? Like, that's just a small bit of it. And then you don't even know how someone actually gives trust. So some people will give trust first, and then your actions will kind of deduct from it. And then others are like, you earn my trust because of how much I've got burned in the past or whatever has happened. So when you talk about that empathy and that proactivity piece, I'm like, yes, that resonates so much. And the other part of it that I want to dive into is the feedback component, because sometimes, like you said, we don't actually get helpful feedback. We're like, okay, what could I do better? And then they're like, nah, you're doing awesome. And they're like, okay, but what can I actually do differently because you wrote something different? So looking back at what you know now, if someone wants to actually get really helpful feedback, have you found certain questions that have helped you pull helpful information out of the other individual?
Yeah. So I think a couple of them start with this. A is just do it at a more like set up time at a more frequent cadence, right? I think feedback again is one of those things which any sort of high performing organization, high performing team needs. But even if it's like two individuals, even if you and I are working together on anything, maybe, let's just say we have a podcast together, it's just something we both need to give each other. But we don't need to make it this big thing. I think what happens in the professional setting, unfortunately, is people still carry that mindset from like the academic life where feedback is equal to evaluation, which is equal to this big sort of stamp. Now you have an A, you have a B, and it's going to carry you with you for the rest of your life. So I would just say to first just take away that whole sort of aura around the word feedback and reduce the intensity is just at a very regular cadence. Again, early on, maybe even once a week is not bad on a Friday. Just set up sort of a feedback conversation. So that's one thing that I do. Then the other sort of things I've started doing, it's not revolutionary, but very simple, the stop, start, continue sort of thing, right? Like last week, given this is where we're working on, what are things that I did well tactically that I should continue doing? What are things that, you felt I did in a meeting, in a document, in whatever piece of work that, we're doing together that maybe I should stop doing or reconsider doing. And then, things that you'd sort of expect that I start doing, right? Like these are things I think that really helps. And then what I always find helpful, especially if you are sort of labeled a high performer in an organization, is a lot of times managers will be like, you're doing great, you're like a high performer. We know that. And I think that sort of limits your growth. So I've always made it a bit about the future. If this is where I want to get to, it could be whatever the next sort of, if you're in a traditional sort of organization with a ladder, it could be the next step on the ladder. If it's a separate role in an organization, it could be that. Saying, hey, if, eventually, I'm not saying I need a promotion this quarter, but aspirationally, that's where I want to go. Given that, like, what are the gaps? Like, what do I need to start doing more? Where do I need to show up more? Are there other stretch assignments I need to take? I think that also always really helps get feedback out, especially for people who are high performers in organizations. I feel like most organizations, fortunately, unfortunately, if you're in the bottom, I think very quickly it just becomes clear. Like most organizations just, will make sure that you sort of understand and you need support or the way most places work, like you would be gently sort of told this is not for you. But I think the folks who really suffer getting great quality feedback are sometimes people, in the I'm doing well plus level where it can get really frustrating. And I think that's also what leads to cycles of disappointment for people because in their head, they're like, I'm ready for the next rung. Like this time I'm getting the promotion and then it doesn't happen. And that also leads to a lot of like resentment in people that what more can I do? I'm already burnt out and my manager or the leader doesn't recognize me. So those are maybe a few sort of tactical pieces of how I go about it is like recognize sort of where you are, make it very normal part of your operating model. So it doesn't feel like this big thing that happens once a quarter. And then just push the other person to give you very sort of tactical examples, actual things that you can make a note of so that every time you meet them next, you can say, last time you told me these 3 things, I did these 2. What's your feedback on that? How do you think that's going?
I love how tangible that is, especially when you said future forward. What's that next thing that could help me as an example? And then following up, oh, this is what I did. So now what is your feedback? Because that follow-up piece and follow-through piece is huge for anyone who's looking at you. Like, well, why would I give you all this feedback and advice if you're going to do absolutely nothing with it? And I mean, there is a time and place where you're like, you know what? Thanks for the feedback. Maybe it's just not applicable right now based on the context that I'm in. I'm going to switch gears towards the internal reflection piece. When it comes to leadership, self-leadership is huge. So how do you effectively lead the leader within?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, if you'd asked me this even like a couple of years back, it'd be like, what? But I think as I've sort of grown in my own sort of career journey and I've thought a lot about this, I think as you in life, right, even in your career, as you sort of grow, you eventually get to a place where there's never a black, white, right, wrong answer. It's very rare you're exposed to situations when there's a very clear moral right and a moral wrong. It's always these gray areas. And I think one of the best ways to lead from within, and I did some work on this maybe a couple of years back with a coach, is to sit down and define my personal values, right? Because initially it was almost... And it's not just with the idea of how you show up and how you lead other people, but it really guides a lot of things that you eventually end up doing with your life, like including taking professional sort of decisions around, is this the right role for me at this season of my life? And do I thrive in it? And so I think when you say, how do you lead the leader within, I think it needs to emanate from some sort of a source code. And to me, I think all our human sort of source code is the values that we hold dear to ourselves and we stand for, right? And I think that sort of is in my head almost like an anchor that every leader needs. You need some sort of weight or some sort of principles, values that ground you, that you are aware of, people close to you are aware of. Eventually, you can then start making calls, and that gets manifested in how you show up, how you lead your team. Because I realize in the absence of that, you almost feel like this weightless thing. It's very hard to explain, but it's like you're sort of swinging, you're making decisions, etc., which are sometimes contradictory. You're showing up in ways which people aren't really sure of. So to me, one of the most like fundamental things that I think most people can do, and you can start at this at any level. That's the beauty of like leading yourself, is to really step back and say, okay, if there are all these sort of words that exist, what are maybe the top 3, 4 that I resonate with, which I hold really dear to, which are sort of my values and how I show up in the world. And that's where everything else then starts from.
I love how you tie that into decision making. And now I want to tie it into that performance and well-being piece, right? So what is a habit, routine, or a mindset that you practice so that you can perform at your best, but also prioritize well-being?
I'm someone who really enjoys like doing a whole host of things. And I've realized that I enjoy, I don't want to call it like productivity because that has like a bad sort of, again, connotation with it. But I like to end my day by saying, look, like I just didn't like vegetate, right? Like something happened. Either my brain kind of got exposed to something new and I learned something, or I put a little bit of me outside in the world. And I also have a young child. And so what I realized over time was that you know, I cannot manage time, but I can manage energy. And so that's how I sort of work, where I don't try and manage my time, but it's more, figure out for myself things that are energy giving and energy draining. And then try my best to just reduce the stuff that's energy draining. Or if I know I have to do it, because sometimes, the thing about being an adult sometimes is we have to do things which maybe we don't absolutely enjoy, but just has to be done, then work around it to make sure that I balance it with something that gives me energy back, so I can sort of show up, right? And so for me, things that really give me energy, I really like being physical, right? I like doing things with my body. I grew up being a competitive athlete, and so even if it's like stepping out for a walk, right? Energy giving. Like I really enjoy lifting. Doesn't look like right now, but I used to be a serious athlete and do a lot of CrossFit. So I really enjoy the act of just powerlifting and knowing that my body can do things. So that's for me very energy giving. Reading is very energy giving for me. And it's reading. So I've made it a thing where I have a big tote bag, and wherever I go, whenever I step out of the house, I always have a book with me. And what that does is, if there's like 10, 15 minutes waiting for a bus, waiting for the train, waiting for your Uber at a doctor's office, instead of scrolling my phone, which I realized would just make me be like, what did I do with my day? I get like 10 pages read of a book and I feel refreshed again. I really enjoy meeting new people. So doing something like this, I write a newsletter. Meeting people for that every other week is extremely energy giving to me, even though it takes away time and, it takes energy. But I know it sort of fills my cup enough so that I can do a bunch of things. Any of these micro habits, it's very hard to like lift and shift from one individual to the other. But I guess the big sort of base really is that whoever you are as an individual, step back and ask yourself, what are things that give me energy and what are things that take energy from me? And it could look drastically different from people. Like I absolutely detest cooking. I know some women love cooking. So it's one of those things, is to just figure out like what are your 2, 3 activities, and then very consciously try and schedule them. If you can through the day, great, but at least through the week you should do enough of those so that you don't by the end of it fully feel like what a shitty week. I'm totally exhausted.
I can totally relate about the cooking piece of it, and the fitness piece. Like I cook up to sustain myself. I don't do it because I find it as a stress reliever. If anything, it's stress inducing at times. And then fitness wise, like I hear you where I need it for my body, but I find myself negotiating with myself sometimes. So at the end of the day, you're like, I'm exhausted, even though this is like health and fitness or whatever is a value of mine, but I'd rather just lay here and do nothing. So given how busy your schedule is, how do you hold yourself accountable and prioritize your well-being so that you can continue to perform at your best, especially when you keep wanting to negotiate sometimes with, I think I'm okay today?
I think it just comes with me just scheduling the hell out of it. I grew up in a military family, and maybe that sort of helps, where my parents were both actually in the military. And so it's a little bit of just putting it in my calendar. And I'm very much, and I know we say MBTI is like whatever corporate horoscope, and I know it's debunked enough, but every time I've taken that test, I'm one of those JJ people. So just like hyper planned. And I always tell this to people that I am very creative, but that's because I have scheduled all the mundane things in my life. Like once you schedule everything mundane, you have energy for the spontaneity. And so in my case, it's a little bit of every sort of Sunday, I look at my calendar, and workout slots, etc., have just been like scheduled. And because it's in my calendar, I've created space for it. And I'm just that kind of person. And this might just, be an individual thing where if it's there, I'll get myself to get up and go do it, right? Some days, is it hard? Yes. Is it easier to have a little bit more of that motivation earlier in the day than later? Yes. But I've also realized that every time I go and work out, I feel much better. So days like what you said, right? It's the end of the day, I'm like, I'd rather just sit and scroll on Netflix, or I'd rather just scroll through social media. I push myself and I say, if I wear my workout clothes, I'm just going to go and do this, right? Because I know I'll feel much better after that. And then this is a little bit of a hack. Every time I work from home, I just like wear my workout clothes for calls. If I know it's not going to be crazy external facing calls, I just change like the top layer. Because that's the other thing I've realized. If I'm in my workout gear, it's just a higher probability I'll go work out and come back. I feel the whole idea of, motivation sometimes is a little overrated, because I think a lot of times it just is discipline. And I know it's easier for some folks than others. And I know there's a lot of sort of, depends on sort of your mental makeup, etc. Some of this might just seem like crazy. But if you are someone who can, just tell yourself that this is important and I'm going to be disciplined or have an accountability buddy, it just makes it so much easier to get up and say, I'm just going to go do it. And so that's how I get the motivation. Is it perfect every time? No, but I'd say most weeks I somehow manage to make it work.
Kudos to you, and I appreciate you sharing your insights. Now I'm going to dive into the gray areas of leadership, and I know you touched on that just a little bit earlier. What I've realized is growth in leadership usually happens when navigating the gray areas of life. Like you said, it's very rare that it's black and white. So when you're in front of them, path isn't clear, you're like, I don't know exactly what I need to do. Can you share a story with us of how you've learned to effectively lead through the gray?
I think one which I'm not going to repeat is those values. I think it's very important to sort of know that, this is my sort of values, and maybe this is the path I would take. The other thing that I did, and this is a concept I learned of in business school, actually. It's called having a personal board of advisors, like organizations and have board of directors. It's almost like you have your own set of advisors. And these are not necessarily like mentors, but they could be people. And I have I'd say about 8-9 people who I consider as a part of my personal board who come from different parts of your life. So it could be someone who knows you really well and understands like personally what's important to you, but it could also be another individual in that group who, you professionally admire, but they may not know you and your life story as well. And there could be someone else who's a degree or two sort of removed. Essentially, what you want is diversity of thought, people, sort of lived experiences in these people. And I always try and in my sort of personal board of advisors also have someone who I know will push my thinking, who is a little contrarian to how I would think, because I also think groupthink is real. And if you're only in a bubble where everybody is eventually going to choose the same thing that you would, it pushes you to make that decision, which may not. So in my this personal board that I've collected, I also have 1 or 2 individuals who I know that a couple of their values are different from mine. They would prioritize certain things, which would probably be my second, third order priority, but for them, it's their first order, right? And so what I do is I almost call it like a bat signal, where it's not like I'm talking to them at a frequent cadence. It's when some of this happens, I reach out to them and I'm like, hey, there's this sort of decision I'm grappling with. I'm just going to tell you about the situation without coloring sort of your judgment with where I'm leaning, and just present sort of facts to you. And given who you are, what would you do? Right? And then they usually give an answer. Then, given what you know about me, what do you think I should do? And then, you go and seek sort of diverse sort of opinions. And then eventually, I think that's the other thing about being a leader, right? At some point, you have to take accountability and you've got to take a call and more importantly, be okay with the consequences of that call. So that's how I mostly navigate it when it really is this like tricky gray area, especially a decision which I know is very consequential. I put a little bit more thinking into it as to, my values, who am I, how would I decide, seek a lot of different sort of opinions and then take a call. But there are a lot of other decisions also, which I think are in the gray area. But, it's the concept of like revolving doors and one-shot doors. So revolving means you can make the call, but in case things sort of go haywire, you can easily come back to where you started. You lose a little bit of time, maybe some energy and money, but it's not one and done. The amount of sort of thinking I would do, the rigor and the analysis is probably a little lower, because in that case, you're like, life will tell me. The best way to learn is to just be in this experimental mental state. And so for those sort of gray area decisions, these are 5 options. Best call at this point, knowing what we know is this. Let's take it. Let's revisit after 3-4 weeks. If it felt odd, then have the sort of humility to say that I'm human, I'm flawed, and I can also make a wrong call. And so maybe option 1 wasn't the right course of action. Maybe let's pivot and do option 2 instead.
Appreciate that you walked us through that thought process, because contextually it's going to be so different for each individual. And what I really hope when I ask these questions is for individuals to start understanding, okay, how do I ask questions? How do I evaluate and assess and go from there, right? So you can make sure that you do what makes sense for your context. And one of your areas of expertise includes capability building. As we look forward, what is a thought that you'd like to leave with leaders when it comes to beefing up their skill set as a lead in the future of work?
I think it's again one of those things, and especially, again, don't want to sound very buzzy with Gen AI. And I think just generally with technology, what we've seen in the last year and a half is that a lot of sort of skills, what quote unquote people call hard skills or expertise, etc., are getting some sort of they're getting a little democratized. I still don't believe that true human experts would go, because I think it's I keep making this analogy around tools are, like a tennis racket, but just giving a tennis tennis racket to you or me will not turn us into Roger Federer or Serena Williams. And so I think human expertise and those hard skills in your sort of area is really important. But I think there is this belief that a lot of leaders and a lot of individuals have where I hate the word soft skills. They call some of these leadership skills, human skills, like soft skills, and they almost make it feel like something that's the garnish on top, good to have. But if you don't have it, it's fine, right? As long as you sort of know what your technical area of expertise, you can still lead and grow. And that's the one thing I wish people sort of understand, that just being a great individual contributor or just being a specialist in a subject matter does not automatically mean you're a great leader to yourself or other people. And leadership really is like its own set of skills, and it requires its own set of work and expertise. And we should not confuse the two. Just because someone is a finance whiz does not necessarily mean that they'd be the best sort of people leader of a 200 people organization. That's the only thing I'd leave people with, that the only thing that keeps humans and gives us our edge, especially as machines keep getting smarter and better, is us being more human. And it's, I think, those skills of, are you able to make the right calls, judgment, empathy, communication? Are you able to sort of step back and see the big picture, connect the dots? So irrespective of, whichever stage you are in your career, focus on that. And if you are in organizations where, you can influence capability building, don't make this feel like a good tour afterthought or something only reserved for like the C-suite. It should really sort of trickle down across the organization.
Okay, as we slowly wrap up, given your expertise and what you're paying attention to now, and also reflecting back on your leadership journey, if you could have one resource, whether it be a principle, mentorship, a tool that could have potentially expedite your leadership journey or growth from a mindset perspective, what would that be?
I think it would be creating space to reflect, right? And a lot of times we go through a lot of these experiences. A lot of times we do a lot of different things, try a lot of different things. And I think, especially in this world where everybody's always talking about being very outcome driven, performance driven, whatever word you want to use. And like I said, right, I like being productive. I think the flip side of that is you're just constantly in do mode, and you're never stepping back and sort of thinking and pausing, because it's a very uncomfortable feeling for most people to sit silently with their thoughts and reflect. But I think that's the place where growth happens, is when it's, not necessarily good, bad experiences. I think you can learn from failure. You can learn from success. I just feel people learn from failure more because it forces some sort of reflection. But I think irrespective of, success, failure, I think people should have some practice. And it could be any practice. I'm not advocating for, journaling or one sort of practice. Whatever works for you, where you have these moments where you step back and reflect and think and stay with your thoughts in a silence, so that you can actually learn and grow. And I think that's something that I started doing way later in my life. I spent the first, which served me well, but I spent the first sort of maybe decade of my professional career only focused on hitting milestones and being very sort of outcome driven and just frantically like running. And I wish early on I had learned to like pause and think and decided, which directions to sort of pivot and why.
Appreciate you sharing that with us. And my last question to you is, what's one thing that's top of mind for you that we can either celebrate with you or potentially help you with?
This is a little adjacent to this conversation, but it's something that I am personally very passionate about. I did sort of allude to the fact that I'm a mom. I work in the work world. So something that I'm very, very passionate about, and I have this sort of side project. It's called Decks and Diapers. It's a newsletter where I talk to, women and men who I say are navigating dual ambitions of professional success, personal fulfillment. Usually they're caregivers raising a family. I just think we are in that point right now where a lot of family structures, etc., have changed, but society has not sort of caught up to those structures. And so I don't know if this is to celebrate or help. Maybe it's a bit of a message to both, to people who are leaders in organizations. I think we have certain biases around women in the workplace, right? Irrespective of what the woman's doing in her life. It's like, you have a kid, you're damned. If you don't have a kid, you're damned. It's like, people judge. So I think one of those things that I am sort of very passionate about and a very vocal advocate is that I think women, should have the freedom and the advocacy to choose whatever makes sense for them in their lives, but also beyond a point, like people should just not make assumptions about them and, show up for them the way they would show up for any other sort of colleague, right? Like, just because she's made a certain life choice does not suddenly like devalue whatever her worth in any sphere of her life is. And I just wish that more people out there would recognize that, people go through seasons and phases and continue to sort of sponsor women. It's one of those things I read where a lot of women are over-mentored, under-sponsored. And so that's my big thing, where I think think a lot of times people look at women, and especially early in your career, you're labeled very high potential. But then a lot of women, biology happens or they make a life choice and they're away from the workforce, even for a brief period, which is a maternity leave, which in a career of like decades, like a couple of months should not impact. But suddenly they're like thrown off a track. And so maybe that's the only thought I'd leave with is to, everybody who sort of listens to your podcast and, who are leaders or future leaders, is to just step back and say, how do we support individuals through like all aspects of their life and life stages versus put labels on people very quickly. And then the minute they make a slightly different choice, like rip that label apart and like push them to the side.
What a beautiful call out. Yes, you briefly alluded to your newsletter, but the fact that this is a much bigger issue that I don't think a lot of folks keep top of mind, and how that can actually continue to impact the ability for a woman to bridge some of that income gap, or just what tables that they get to influence as a result of some of these life events that happen. So I really appreciate that call out, Rashi, and thank you so much for sharing your story and your insights. And to everyone else that's tuned into another episode, thank you for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll know, and I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode.